They said Ruth Anne Delacroix had finally lost her senses. In Cedar Bluff, Missouri, a town small enough that the checkout girl at the grocery store knew your grandmother's maiden name, everybody had an opinion about the widow who just signed papers on a dead man's water tank. A water tank, rusted, 20 feet tall, standing on 4 spindly legs in a weed-choked lot at the edge of town, the kind of thing you'd expect to see torn down for scrap, not fought over in a lawyer's office. Ruth Anne had inherited it from a great-uncle she'd met exactly twice in her life. And when the will was read out loud, half the room had laughed before the lawyer even finished the sentence. She hadn't laughed. She'd sat there with her hands folded in her lap, feeling something the rest of them couldn't. Behind the rusted hatch at the top of that tank was a secret nobody in Cedar Bluff had bothered to look for in over 100 years, and what Ruth Anne found up there would turn a joke of an inheritance into the most talked-about discovery this town had ever seen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now stick with me, because the day Ruth Anne climbed that ladder, everything about her life was about to change, and so was everything Cedar Bluff thought it knew about its own history. Ruth Anne wasn't looking for treasure. She was 63 years old, 7 months a widow, and down to counting quarters for the laundromat. Her husband Herman had died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning while fixing the porch railing, and by the time the funeral costs and the medical bills from his last hospital stay were settled, there wasn't much left of the modest life they'd built together. She'd sold the house on Larkspur Street within 4 months, not because she wanted to, but because the property taxes had become a number she couldn't say out loud without her chest tightening. She moved into a rented room above the hardware store owned by a man named Dale Pruitt, who charged her less than market rate because he'd known Herman since high school and felt sorry for her, though he was careful never to say so directly. Ruth Anne worked part-time at the front desk of the Cedar Bluff Medical Clinic, a job that paid enough to keep her fed but not enough to keep her afloat, and some months it didn't manage that either. She hadn't spoken to her mother's side of the family in decades, not out of any grudge, just the slow drift that happens when people move away and stop calling back. So when a certified letter arrived from a law office in Springfield informing her that her late great-uncle Thaddeus Wren had named her sole beneficiary of his estate, she assumed it was a scam, or at best a mistake with somebody else's name attached. It wasn't a mistake. Thaddeus Wren had lived alone on the outskirts of Cedar Bluff for nearly 50 years, a strange, private man that most of the town only knew by reputation, the kind of man children were told not to bother and adults mostly left alone. He died at 91 with no children, no wife, and apparently no assets worth mentioning, aside from a half-acre lot at the edge of an old rail spur that hadn't seen a train since the Eisenhower administration. On that lot stood one structure, a decommissioned steel water tower, the kind that used to supply steam locomotives before diesel engines made them obsolete. Everything else on the property, an old tool shed, a collapsed fence line, had been claimed by weeds and time. When the lawyer read out the full extent of the inheritance in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee, one of Ruth Anne's distant cousins, a woman named Patsy she'd met for the first time that day, actually snored out loud. "That old water tank," Patsy said, not quite under her breath. "Lord, Ruth Anne, you got the raw end of that deal." The lawyer, a tired man named Franklin Otts who clearly wanted to be somewhere else, slid a folder across the table containing the deed, a handwritten letter from Thaddeus, and a single brass key. Ruth Anne read the letter twice before she trusted herself to speak. It was short, just 4 sentences, and none of them explained anything. It said only that the tank had been in the Wren family a long time, that she was the only Wren left who might understand what to do with it, and that she should climb it before she decided whether to sell the land. Patsy laughed again when she heard that part. "He wants you to climb it, at your age. For what? The view." Ruth Anne didn't answer her. She was still holding the brass key, turning it over between her fingers, feeling the same strange certainty she used to feel right before Herman would tell her bad news, that quiet drop in her stomach that told her something important was coming whether she was ready for it or not. She had $300 in her checking account and a room above a hardware store that wasn't really hers. She had no reason in the world to believe a rusted water tank was going to change anything. But she signed the papers anyway, took the key, and told Franklin Ott she'd need directions to the property, because as far as she was concerned, there was nothing left in Cedar Bluff for people to laugh about that they hadn't already laughed about, and she intended to see for herself what her uncle had wanted her to find. The drive out to the old rail spur took 20 minutes, most of it on a gravel road that hadn't seen a grader in years. Ruth had borrowed Dale Pruitt's truck for the trip since her own car, a Buick with a bad transmission, wouldn't have made it over the ruts. Dale offered to come along, and when she said no thank you, he offered to at least follow her out there in case she got stuck. She told him she needed to do this part alone, and something in her voice must have convinced him, because he just nodded and handed her the keys without another word. The property came into view slowly, a half-acre of scrubland bordered by a rusted chain-link fence that had given up trying to keep anyone out. The tank itself stood near the back of the lot, taller than she'd pictured from the photo in Franklin Ott's folder. Its steel legs bolted into concrete footings that had cracked and sunk unevenly into the ground over the decades. Whatever paint had once covered it was long gone, replaced by a mottled orange-brown skin of rust that ran in streaks down each leg. A ladder was welded to one side, rising straight up to a small platform near the top where a hatch sat closed against the sky. Ruth had parked the truck and sat there for a minute just looking at it, the engine ticking as it cooled, before she made herself get out. Word travels fast in a town of 2,000 people, and by the time Ruth had walked the perimeter of the lot twice, a car had already slowed on the gravel road behind her. It was Grant and Felicity Osgood, who owned the biggest house on Chestnut Avenue and made a habit of being seen in places where something interesting might be happening. Felicity rolled down her window without bothering to get out. "Is it true?" she called. "Old Thaddeus left you that thing?" Ruth kept walking, brushing a hand along the fence line. "It's true." Grant leaned across his wife to get a better look, already smirking. "What are you going to do with a water tower, Ruth Anne? Rent it out to pigeons?" Felicity laughed at that. A bright, performative laugh meant to carry, and Grant snapped a photo on his phone before Ruth could turn away. "This is going up on the town page," he said, more to his wife than to her. "Nobody's going to believe this." Ruth didn't dignify it with a response. She'd learned in the 7 months since Herman died that some things weren't worth the breath it took to answer them, and the Osgoods' opinion of her inheritance ranked somewhere below the weather. She waited until their car pulled away, gravel popping under the tires, before she let herself walk to the base of the ladder. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ladder was cold under her palms, even though it was late September, and the afternoon sun hadn't quite given up its warmth yet. Ruth wasn't a young woman anymore, and her knees had been giving her trouble since the spring, but she gripped the rusted rungs and started climbing anyway, one hand over the other, the ground falling away beneath her boots. Halfway up, she stopped to catch her breath, looking out over the flat stretch of Missouri scrubland toward the distant rooftops of Cedar Bluff, the church steeple, the water treatment plant, the faint gray ribbon of the highway. From up here, the town looked smaller than it felt when you were down in it, getting laughed at by people like the Osgoods. She kept climbing. At the top, the platform was barely wide enough for 2 people to stand on, its metal grating pitted with rust, but still solid under her feet when she tested it. The hatch was secured with an old padlock, and for a moment Ruth worried the brass key in her pocket wouldn't fit it at all, that this whole trip would end in nothing but a sore back and a story for the Osgoods to tell at dinner parties. But the key slid into the lock cleanly, like it had been oiled recently, or maybe just never used enough to wear down. It turned with a small, satisfying click, and the padlock fell open in her hand. The hatch itself resisted at first, swollen shut by decades of weather, and Ruth had to brace her boot against the platform and pull with both hands before it finally gave way with a groan of old hinges. A smell rose up out of the darkness inside, stale and metallic, the smell of a space that had been sealed away from the world since before she was born. She didn't see anything at first, just blackness and the faint outline of the tank's curved interior walls. She pulled her phone from her jacket pocket and switched on the flashlight, and the beam caught something she hadn't expected at all. The inside of the tank wasn't empty, and it wasn't full of water either. It was dry, bone dry, the concrete floor at the bottom cracked and pale in the light, and near that floor, Half buried in decades of dust and dead leaves that had somehow found their way in through some gap she couldn't see, sat the outline of something rectangular and man-made. Ruth Anne leaned further into the hatch, her heart picking up in a way it hadn't since before Herman got sick. And for the first time since the reading of the will, she understood exactly why her great-uncle had wanted her to climb up here before she made her decision. Ruth Anne didn't trust herself to reach into the dark without more light. So she climbed back down the ladder first, her legs shaking in a way that had nothing to do with age, and drove the 15 minutes back into town to Dale Pruitt's hardware store before it closed. She bought a battery lantern, a pair of work gloves, and a small pry bar, paying for all of it with cash she'd set aside for groceries, and Dale didn't ask questions beyond whether she wanted a bag. She drove straight back out to the lot as the light started to go gold and long across the scrubland, climbed the ladder a second time with the lantern swinging from her wrist, and lowered herself through the hatch into the tank itself, boots finding the cracked concrete floor with a soft crunch of dead leaves. The space was tighter than it looked from above, maybe 8 feet across, the curved steel walls rising up around her like the inside of a barrel built for giants. She set the lantern down and let her eyes adjust. The rectangular shape she'd seen from the hatch turned out to be a wooden crate, roughly the size of a milk crate but built from thick, dark planks that had somehow survived whatever moisture had once passed through this tank. It sat wedged against the base of the wall, half covered by a drift of dust and leaf litter that must have blown in through a gap near the roof over the course of decades. Ruth Anne knelt beside it, gloves protecting her hands from splinters, and brushed away enough debris to see that the crate had been nailed shut a long time ago, the nail heads corroded to little orange stubs. She worked the pry bar under the lid the way Herman used to open packing crates in their garage, steady pressure instead of force, and after a minute of careful prying the wood gave way with a dry crack that echoed strangely inside the metal shell of the tank. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and was now stiff and brittle with age, she found a leather satchel, a bundle of rolled papers tied with twine, and a heavy iron ledger book with a brass clasp gone green from oxidation. Her hands were trembling as she lifted the ledger out, and on its cover, stamped into the leather in letters worn nearly smooth, she could just make out a name. Solomon Pruitt. She sat back on her heels in the near dark, lantern light flickering against the curved walls, and said the name out loud just to hear how it sounded. Pruitt. It took her a moment to place why the name mattered beyond the coincidence of sharing it with Dale. And when she did, her stomach turned over. Every schoolchild in Cedar Bluff grew up hearing the name Pruitt attached to the founding of the rail spur, though nobody ever seemed to know much more than that, just that a man named Pruitt had something to do with why the tracks came through here in the first place instead of bypassing the town entirely the way they'd bypassed half a dozen other little settlements along the river. She had never once connected that name to her own family, and as far as she knew, Thaddeus Wren wasn't related to any Pruitts at all. She opened the ledger carefully, the spine cracking with age, and found pages of cramped handwriting, columns of numbers, notes about water levels and coal deliveries and train schedules going back to a date she had to read twice to believe. 1889. She climbed down out of the tank that evening with the satchel and the ledger cradled against her chest like something that might shatter, and drove home in the dark with the truck's high beams cutting through a road she could barely see. By the next morning, the photo Grant Osgood had taken of her at the fence line was already circulating on the Cedar Bluff community page, captioned with something about pigeons and inheritance, and a laughing emoji that had collected over 40 reactions by the time Ruth Ann's coworker Marcus Teal showed it to her at the clinic front desk, grinning like he expected her to laugh along. She didn't. She just handed back his phone and told him she had patience to check in, and he shrugged and went back to restocking the supply closet, muttering something about how some people just couldn't take a joke. What none of them knew, not the Osgoods with their smug commentary, not Marcus with his careless grin, not even Dale Pruitt who'd sold her the lantern without a second thought, was that Ruth Anne had spent the entire night before at her small kitchen table above the hardware store, reading Solomon Pruitt's ledger by the light of a desk lamp until nearly 3 in the morning. And what she'd found in those pages had nothing to do with water levels or coal deliveries at all. Tucked between 2 entries from the winter of 1891 was a folded document sealed with a wax stamp so old it had cracked into pieces the moment she touched it. A document that used words like grant and easement and perpetual right-of-way, words she didn't fully understand but recognized as the kind of language that belonged in a courthouse. not a rusted water tank on the edge of a dead rail line. She didn't know yet what any of it meant for her, or for the half-acre lot Thaddeus Wren had left behind, but she knew enough to understand that her great-uncle hadn't sent her up that ladder for nothing, and that whatever laughter was circulating on the Cedar Bluff community page this morning, it wasn't going to last nearly as long as the people laughing thought it would. Ruth Anne spent the next 2 days doing the only thing that made sense to her, which was reading the ledger cover to cover, twice, at the little kitchen table above Dale Pruitt's store, filling a spiral notebook with names and dates she didn't yet understand but felt certain mattered. On the third morning, she called in sick to the clinic, which she hadn't done once in the 2 years she'd worked there, and drove to the Cedar Bluff Public Library with the ledger, the satchel, and the folded document wrapped carefully in a dish towel on the passenger seat beside her. The library occupied half of the old county building on 2nd Street, a squat brick structure that also housed the tax assessor's office, and, somewhere in the back, a small local history room that Ruth Anne had walked past 100 times without ever going inside. The woman behind the reference desk introduced herself as Colette Ambrose, a stocky, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair. And when Ruth Anne explained what she was looking for, something changed in Colette's expression, a kind of alertness that hadn't been there a moment before. "Solomon Pruitt," Colette repeated, already standing up from her desk. "Where did you hear that name?" Ruth Anne set the ledger down on the counter between them, and Colette's hand went to it slowly, almost reverently, the way a person touches something they've been told about but never expected to see. She led Ruth Anne into the back room, a narrow space lined with filing cabinets and boxes of donated papers that the Historical Society had never quite gotten around to properly cataloging. And for the next 3 hours, the two of them worked through everything Colette could pull that mentioned the name Pruitt or the old rail spur, or the founding of Cedar Bluff itself. What emerged, piece by piece, was a story nobody in town seemed to actually know anymore, buried under 130 years of assumption and half-remembered local trivia. Solomon Pruitt hadn't just had something to do with the railroad coming through Cedar Bluff. He'd been the engineer who'd surveyed the entire spur line, and more importantly, he'd been the one who'd negotiated directly with the railroad company to secure water rights along a 2-mile stretch of the White River tributary that ran behind what was now the edge of town, because without a reliable water source for the steam locomotives, the railroad would have routed around Cedar Bluff entirely, and the town likely wouldn't exist in anything like its current form. In exchange for securing those rights and building the water tower that still stood on Thaddeus Wren's half-acre lot, Pruitt had been granted something unusual for a man of his position: a perpetual easement over the water source itself, along with mineral and access rights to the surrounding parcels, terms that Colette said she'd never actually seen documented anywhere, only referenced obliquely in a handful of town council minutes from the early 1900s that nobody had bothered to follow up on. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "This is the actual grant," Colette said, holding the cracked, wax-sealed document up to the light with gloved hands she'd insisted on wearing before letting Ruth Anne open it further. "I've read about this in passing, in a footnote in a county history somebody self-published in the 70s, but I always assumed it was lost. Nobody's ever produced the original." Ruth Anne sat very still, watching Colette's hand shake slightly as she unfolded the brittle paper another inch. "What does it mean, though? Practically?" Colette didn't answer right away. She set the document down with exaggerated care and looked at Ruth Anne over the top of her glasses. "It means your uncle's water tower isn't just an old water tower. It means whoever holds this grant, and it looks like Solomon Pruitt's line of inheritance passed it down to Thaddeus Wren somehow, has a legal claim to water and mineral rights running under a good portion of what's now downtown Cedar Bluff. I'm not a lawyer, but I know enough about how these old easements work to tell you that this is not nothing, Ruth Anne. This might be the single most significant historical document to come out of this county in my lifetime." Ruth Anne thought about the Osgood's photos circulating online, the pigeon jokes, Marcus Teal's careless grin at the clinic front desk, and felt something settle in her chest that wasn't quite vindication yet, more like the first steady ground she'd stood on since Herman died. She asked Colette how they were supposed to find out whether any of this actually held up, whether a century-old handshake agreement between a railroad engineer and a long-defunct rail company could possibly mean anything in a modern courtroom. And Colette said she didn't know, but she knew who might. She picked up the phone on her desk and started dialing before Ruth and had even finished her sentence, explaining as she waited for someone to pick up that she had a friend from graduate school, a property law professor now teaching at the University of Missouri, who owed her a favor and who was, as far as Colette knew, still very much alive and still very much interested in exactly this kind of forgotten legal tangle. Ruth Anne sat in the small back room, surrounded by boxes of county history nobody had opened in decades, holding a name in her notebook that had belonged to nobody in Cedar Bluff for over a century, and understood for the first time that whatever she'd climbed up that ladder to find, it was bigger than either she or her great-uncle Thaddeus could have handled alone. Professor Iris Kavanaugh arrived in Cedar Bluff 4 days later, driving in from Columbia in a small gray sedan packed with a laptop bag and 2 accordion folders of blank paper she said she'd fill by the end of the visit. She was younger than Ruth Anne expected, maybe 50, with the brisk, unhurried manner of someone who'd spent a career being the smartest person in rooms that didn't always appreciate it. Colette met her at the library, and the 3 of them spread every document across the long table in the back room. The ledger, the grant, the satchel of loose correspondence Ruth Anne still hadn't fully gone through, and Iris spent the better part of a day reading in near silence, occasionally asking a question and writing something in the margins of a legal pad without explaining what it meant. By evening, she sat back in her chair and rubbed her eyes and told Ruth Anne, in the plain, unhedged way of a person who'd rather be direct than kind, that this was the strongest claim she'd seen in 15 years of teaching property law, and that she wanted to bring in someone who actually litigated cases like this, because her own expertise stopped at the classroom door. The someone she called was Denise Okafor, a property attorney out of Springfield who'd once been Iris's student and had built a small but sharp practice specializing in exactly this kind of century-old title dispute. Denise drove out the following week, read through everything in a single afternoon, and by the time she left she'd agreed to take the case without asking Ruth Anne for a retainer, telling her plainly that she'd rather take a percentage of whatever came out of a settlement than watch a case this interesting get buried for lack of funding. Over the next several weeks, word started moving through Cedar Bluff in a different register than the pigeon jokes had. Denise filed initial paperwork with the county recorder's office. The Missouri State Historical Society sent a small team to examine the tank itself, a structural engineer and an archivist who spent 2 full days documenting the rivets, the tank's construction date, and the platform where Ruth Anne had first turned that brass key. Dr. Walter Bing, who ran the regional office of the Historical Society, stood at the base of the ladder on the second day and told Ruth Anne, without any of the mockery she'd braced herself for, that the tank was very likely the last intact steam-era water tower left standing anywhere in that part of the state, and that its condition alone made it a candidate for historic designation, regardless of anything the grant turned out to mean legally. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The town noticed all of this the way small towns notice everything, slowly at first, and then all at once. Grant Osgood's photo had over 200 comments on it by the time somebody, likely Colette, posted a correction underneath explaining exactly what had been found up in that tank, and the tone of the comments shifted within a matter of hours from mockery to a strange, defensive curiosity, people asking whether it was true, whether the town itself might have some claim, whether Ruth Anne Delacroix was about to become rich off a joke of an inheritance nobody else had wanted. Marcus Teal stopped bringing it up at the clinic front desk. Felicity Osgood, Ruth Anne heard secondhand, had deleted her original comment about pigeons, though the photo itself stayed up, drawing new attention every day. It was Denise Okafor who finally sat Ruth Anne down in Colette's back room, 6 weeks after that first climb up the ladder, and explained what her research had actually turned up once she'd traced the chain of title back through county records nobody had touched since the original filings. The mineral and water rights Solomon Pruitt had negotiated in 1891 had never been formally severed when the railroad company sold off its remaining Cedar Bluff holdings in the 1920s, a clerical oversight that had simply been carried forward, unnoticed, through every subsequent transfer of the land above it. That meant a significant stretch of property under the modern downtown, including the town's own water treatment facility and a strip of commercial land along Main Street, technically still owed water access rights and a share of any mineral extraction to whoever held Pruitt's original grant. Denise was careful to say that Missouri wasn't sitting on some untapped vein of anything valuable underground, that the mineral component was likely worth little on its own, but the water rights were a different matter entirely, because the treatment facility drew directly from the tributary Pruitt had secured access to, and had been doing so for decades without ever formally acquiring clear rights to it. "You're not going to bankrupt the town," Denise told her, watching Ruth Ann's face carefully as she said it. "But you have real leverage here, Ruth Anne. Real, legally defensible leverage. Depending on how a settlement gets negotiated, and depending on what the state decides this historic designation is worth in preservation funding, you could be looking at something in the range of $2 to $3 million. Ruth Anne sat with that number for a long moment, turning it over the way she'd turned the brass key over in her fingers on the day she first read Thaddeus's letter, and found that it didn't feel like the number Denise clearly expected it to feel like. It felt distant, almost unreal, the way large numbers always do to a person who has spent 7 months counting quarters for the laundromat. What she felt more clearly, sitting in that cramped back room surrounded by boxes of forgotten county history, was the shape of a decision starting to form somewhere behind her ribs, one she hadn't fully admitted to herself yet, but one that had everything to do with the letter and nothing at all to do with the number Denise had just said out loud. The negotiations took most of the winter. Denise Okafor filed formal claims with the county recorder's office in November, and by the time the first hard frost settled over Cedar Bluff, 3 separate parties had entered the dispute. The town itself, represented by a municipal attorney who seemed permanently exasperated by the whole situation, the water treatment facility's private operating contractor, who stood to lose the most if the rights weren't resolved in their favor, and a handful of downtown property owners whose deeds, it turned out, sat directly within the boundary of Solomon Pruitt's original grant. Mayor Vivian Castellano called an emergency session of the town council in early December, and Ruth Anne attended at Denise's insistence, sitting near the back of a room that smelled like radiator heat and old carpet, while council members argued over whether the town should simply try to buy Ruth Anne out before the historic designation made the property and the rights attached to it even harder to acquire. One councilman, a heavy-set real estate developer named Boyd Halverson, stood up twice to suggest the town pursue eminent domain, a suggestion Mayor Castellano shut down both times, reminding him flatly that seizing a widow's water tower 2 months after it made regional news would not reflect well on anyone in that room. The meeting ended without resolution, but Ruth Anne left it understanding something Denise had been trying to tell her for weeks, which was that this wasn't going to end cleanly no matter what happened, because too many people now had something at stake in a decision that had started as one woman climbing a ladder alone. The complication that worried Denise most surfaced in January, when a title search turned up 11 separate downtown parcels whose current owners had purchased their property decades ago with no knowledge that mineral or water rights beneath their land had never technically been theirs to fully claim. Some of these owners were sympathetic figures, an elderly couple who ran the hardware store 2 doors down from Dale Pruitt's, a young family who'd bought their first home only 3 years earlier. Others were less sympathetic, including Grant and Felicity Osgood, whose large house on Chestnut Avenue sat on one of the affected parcels, a detail that made its way around Cedar Bluff fast enough that Ruth Anne heard about it from 3 different people before Denise even confirmed it herself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ruth Anne thought about the Osgoods' laughter at the fence line more than she wanted to admit, the photo, the pigeon comment, Felicity's bright performative laugh carrying across the gravel road. Some nights, lying awake in the rented room above Dale's store, she let herself imagine what it would feel like to watch Grant Osgood sit across a negotiating table and pay for the ground under his own house, and she wasn't proud of how good that imagining felt, at least at first. But the feeling never lasted long, because underneath it was something Herman used to say to her more than once during their 31 years together, usually after she'd come home frustrated by some small unfairness at work or in town, that holding onto a grudge was like carrying a hot coal waiting for the right moment to throw it, and the only person it ever burned in the meantime was you. She thought about that a great deal in January, sitting at her kitchen table with Denise's settlement projections spread out in front of her, real numbers now instead of Denise's earlier estimate, closer to $2.8 million once the water rights, the mineral claim, and a state preservation grant for the tank itself were all accounted for. She thought about Thaddeus Wren too, a man she'd met exactly twice. Once as a child at a funeral she barely remembered, and once as an adult when he'd shown up unannounced at her and Herman's house selling nothing, wanting nothing, just sitting on their porch for an hour talking about weather before he left as quietly as he'd arrived. She hadn't understood, at the time, why a man who barely knew her would leave her the one thing his own family had apparently guarded and never spoken of for over a century. Sitting with the ledger open in front of her one evening in late January, rereading the 4 short sentences of his letter for what must have been the 50th time, she finally understood what he'd meant by asking her to climb the tank before deciding whether to sell. He hadn't wanted her to inherit money. He'd wanted her to inherit the choice of what to do with it. The same choice, she suspected, that he himself had carried alone for 50 years and never made, letting the grant sit sealed in a wax stamp inside a wooden crate instead of cashing it in, protecting whatever it represented from people who might not use it the way he thought it deserved to be used. Denise called at the end of January with an update that the 11 downtown parcel owners had organized themselves into a group with their own attorney, preparing to fight the claim rather than settle, and that a full trial, if it came to that, could drag on for years and cost more in legal fees than the eventual settlement might even be worth. Ruth Anne listened to all of it calmly, took notes in the same spiral notebook she'd been filling since that first night with the ledger, and told Denise she needed a week to think before deciding how to move forward. It wasn't the number she was thinking about anymore, and it wasn't the Osgoods either. It was a shape starting to settle into something clearer than it had been in the back room of the library 6 weeks earlier, something that had less to do with what she was owed and more to do with what her great-uncle, and maybe even Solomon Pruitt before him, had actually been trying to protect all along. Ruth Anne called Denise back after 5 days instead of the full week, and told her she wanted to schedule a public meeting rather than continue the private back and forth with the 11 parcel owners' attorney, a decision that surprised Denise enough that she asked twice whether Ruth Anne understood she was giving up a significant amount of negotiating leverage by doing it in the open. Ruth Anne told her she understood exactly what she was giving up, and that she wanted to do it anyway. Mayor Castellano agreed to hold the session in the high school gymnasium instead of the usual council chambers, because word had already spread that Ruth Anne Delacroix intended to make some kind of announcement about the water tower claim, and the town clerk warned that the regular meeting room wouldn't hold the crowd. She was right. By the time Ruth Anne arrived on a cold Thursday evening in early February, wearing the good wool coat she'd bought for Herman's funeral because it was the nicest thing she owned, the gymnasium bleachers were nearly full. Folding chairs had been set up on the floor to handle the overflow, and a low hum of conversation filled the room the way it does before a basketball game rather than a town meeting. Denise sat beside her at a folding table set up at center court, a thin folder of documents in front of her, and Ruth Anne could see Colette Ambrose in the 3rd row, and Dr. Walter Bing near the back, and Gran and Felicity Osgood sitting stiffly together about halfway up the bleachers on the visitor's side, Felicity's arms crossed tight over her chest. Mayor Castellano called the meeting to order and explained, briefly, why everyone was there, before turning the floor over. Ruth Anne stood up slowly, feeling the wool coat pull a little at her shoulders, and walked to the small standing microphone someone had set up at half court. 6 months ago, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, carrying easily in the quiet gymnasium. I inherited a rusted water tower most of you thought was a joke. Some of you said so, out loud, where I could hear it. I understand why. It looked like nothing. She paused, letting that settle, watching a few people in the bleachers shift uncomfortably, though she hadn't said it to embarrass anyone, only because it was true. What I found inside that tank turned out to be worth close to $3 million. According to my attorney's most recent estimate, once you account for water rights, mineral claims, and a preservation grant tied to its historical designation. I know most of you have heard some version of that number by now. I wanted to stand here tonight and tell you myself what I've decided to do with it. She glanced down at a single index card in her hand, though she'd read it so many times over the past week that she barely needed it anymore. First, regarding the 11 property owners whose land sits within the boundary of the original grant. I'm not going to pursue individual claims against any of you. My attorney will be filing paperwork this month to formally release those parcels from any claim tied to my great-uncle's grant, at no cost, effective immediately. A ripple went through the gymnasium at that, murmured surprise loud enough that Ruth Anne had to wait a moment before continuing. Denise, beside her, kept her expression carefully neutral, though Ruth Anne knew this was the part of the plan that had taken the longest to convince her attorney was a good idea. Second, regarding the water rights themselves, I'm working with the town and with the treatment facilities operator to formalize a permanent, low-cost access agreement, so that Cedar Bluff never has to worry about this again, and so that whoever comes after me in the Wren family, if anyone ever does, can't hold this town over a barrel the way it could have been held tonight. She looked out at the crowd, found Grant Osgood's face in the bleachers, and didn't linger on it, though she noticed he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. Third, the tank itself, and the half-acre it sits on, isn't going to be sold. Dr. Bing and the Historical Society have already begun the paperwork for a National Register listing, and once that's finalized, we're going to restore it properly with help from the State Preservation Grant. And we're going to build something around it, a small foundation run out of that lot that helps people in this town who find themselves where I was 7 months ago, people who've lost a spouse and don't know how they're going to make the next mortgage payment. People counting quarters for the laundromat and too proud to say so out loud. Her voice caught slightly on that last part, the first time it had all evening, and she let it because there wasn't any use pretending otherwise in a room full of people who'd watched her go through exactly that. My great-uncle sat on this discovery for 50 years and never touched it, because I think he understood something I only figured out myself a few weeks ago, which is that some inheritances aren't really about what they're worth. They're about what you're willing to do with them, when nobody's forcing your hand. Mayor Castellano was the first to stand and start clapping, and the sound spread through the bleachers in an uneven wave, some people slower to their feet than others. But by the time Ruth Anne stepped back from the microphone, most of the gymnasium was standing. Felicity Osgood was one of the last to rise, and when she did, Ruth Anne watched her lean over and say something to Grant, though from that distance there was no way to know what it was. Colette made her way down from the third row before Ruth Anne had even gathered her coat, and pulled her into a hug that smelled faintly of the library's old paper and floor wax, and told her, quietly enough that only Ruth Anne could hear, that Thaddeus Wren would have been proud of her, though neither of them could have really known that for certain. 1 year, almost to the day after she'd first climbed that ladder with a borrowed lantern swinging from her wrist, Ruth Anne Delacroix stood at the base of the same water tower and watched a construction crew hang a new sign on the chain-link fence, one that read Wren Pruitt Foundation in simple black lettering, with smaller text underneath explaining that the site was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The tank itself had been sandblasted down to bare steel and repainted a deep, unfussy green that Colette had helped her pick out from a catalog of period-appropriate colors, and the ladder Ruth Anne had climbed twice in one September afternoon now had a safety cage bolted around it, required by the contractor before anyone else would be allowed up to see the restored platform and the hatch that had sat locked for over a century before she turned that brass key. Beside the tank, where weeds and a collapsed fence line used to be, stood a modest single-story building, not much bigger than a double-wide trailer, that housed 2 offices, a small waiting room, and a supply closet that Ruth Anne had personally stocked with the kind of things she remembered needing most during those 7 hardest months of her life: gift cards for the grocery store, information on utility assistance programs, a list of local contractors willing to do small repair jobs at reduced rates for seniors living alone. Colette Ambrose had left her position at the library within 3 months of the town meeting to run the foundation full-time, and she'd hired a young caseworker named Priya Deshmukh to handle intake, and between the two of them, in that first year, they'd helped 61 people in Cedar Bluff and the surrounding county, mostly widows and widowers. Mostly people too proud to ask for help until someone made it easy enough that asking didn't feel like defeat. Ruth Anne still lived above Dale Pruitt's hardware store, though she'd finally started paying him full rent once the settlement cleared, something he'd argued against for a full week before she simply left the extra money on his counter and refused to take no for an answer. She could have moved. Denise had told her more than once that with the settlement money, she could buy back the house on Larkspur Street twice over if she wanted to, and live comfortably for the rest of her life without lifting another finger. Ruth Anne had thought about it briefly in the weeks right after the gymnasium meeting, and had decided against it for reasons she found hard to explain to people who asked, though she tried anyway when Priya asked her directly one afternoon in the foundation's small kitchen. "I don't need the house back," Ruth Anne told her, pouring coffee from a pot that had definitely seen better decades. "I needed to know I could survive without it, and now I know. That's worth more to me than the house ever was." She kept one thing from the whole ordeal that had nothing to do with money, a small brass key that no longer opened anything, since the padlock had been replaced during restoration, but she'd had it mounted in a shadow box that hung now in the foundation's front office, next to a framed copy of the original 1891 grant, the one with the wax seal that had cracked apart the moment she'd first touched it. Underneath the key, on a small brass plate Dale had cut for her at cost, were the 4 sentences from Thaddeus Wren's letter, the same ones she'd read 50 times at her kitchen table before she understood what they meant. Grant and Felicity Osgood had, in the end, made a donation to the foundation, not a large one, but not a token gesture either. And Felicity had shown up in person to hand over the check, standing awkwardly in the doorway of Ruth Ann's small office for a long moment before finally saying she was sorry, really sorry for the photo, for the pigeon comment, for all of it. Ruth Anne had accepted the apology the way she'd learned to accept most things that year, without making the other person work too hard for it, because holding on to that particular coal had never done her any good either. Marcus Teal still worked the front desk at the clinic, and every now and then he'd mention, half joking, that he owed his career to Ruth Anne for not quitting on the spot the day he showed her that photo, and she let him have the joke because some things were easier to laugh about once enough time had passed. On the evening the sign went up, Ruth Anne climbed the caged ladder one more time, slower now than she had that first September afternoon, her knees no better than they'd been a year earlier despite everything else that had changed. She sat on the restored platform as the sun went down over Cedar Bluff, the same view she'd caught her breath looking at the very first time, the church steeple, the water treatment plant, the highway cutting its gray line towards Springfield, and thought about Herman, and about a man she'd only really known through 4 sentences and a ledger full of a stranger's handwriting, and about how strange it was that the worst year of her life had somehow also become the year she finally understood what she was capable of doing with almost nothing at all. She thought people probably expected her to say the money changed everything, and in some practical sense it had. The foundation existed because of it, 61 people had been helped because of it. But sitting up there with the cold metal grating under her, watching the lights come on across a town that had once laughed her all the way out to a rusted lot on a dead rail spur, she understood that the money was never really the point. Not for her, and maybe not for Thaddeus Wren either. All those years he'd guarded this secret and never touched it. The point was that value doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly behind a locked hatch, waiting for somebody stubborn enough, or desperate enough, or simply willing enough to climb up and look. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.